Yes,
It
please.
took me 2
Yeah.
seconds.
Also, this is a different system.
Now he's on camera.
Yes.
My name is Sameh Iskandar. You all know me except these two beautiful looking people.
John Pinto and Mary Ann Pinto.
Are you going on the trip?
Yes.
So everyone is going on the trip except you and...
But we're repeating almost the trip.
Right.
A few days after.
Okay. I usually get introduced, but because I'm not introduced, I'm going to introduce myself. Gunesh should have introduced me.
Okay.
I'm Sameh Iskandar. I'm born in Egypt, as you can tell from my accent. I'm originally was trained as a civil engineer. I came to this country 50 years ago. I practiced engineering, and then I followed my passion since I was very young to study Egyptology, and I went to NYU and I got a degree. And then after that, I joined NYU, joined another organization which I will talk I will mention while we're talking. I know you're all going on the trip, but some of them are not. I just want to tell you that the talk is geared for those who are going. Okay? So
Austin and Nadia are going on the same trip, but a week
Right.
later or 10 days later.
Okay. So let's just talk.
So the only one is Izzat. So don't
I think he's been there
address
before.
him.
And I have this. I forgot.
Is it warm? You want me to open
Oh, you
it?
got a stick.
I got
You're
stick.
okay?
Comfortable.
Okay.
I've been freezing all day.
We all know Egypt is in Africa, northeast corner of Africa. And I want to start with the big picture, with more statistical and theoretical background to Egypt and Egyptology before we go to the pyramids, Luxor, and the museums. So I will be talking about geography, writing systems, religious beliefs, history, and arcane architecture. Once we finish that, we'll start our trip to the pyramids. Egypt, as I said, northeast corner of Africa. It's bound by the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. It's mostly flat, except that part is mountainous along the Red Sea. It's about to give you a sense of how big Egypt is. It's about 700 miles. It's double the distance between New York City and the Canadian border, to give you a sense how big Egypt is. It's all desert. The inhabitable area is, no talking money. So the inhabitable area is people live only on 5% on the entire size of the country, and that has been the case for the past 4,000 or 5,000 years. Maybe this area has increased by 1 or 2 percentage point, but Egypt back in 3000 BC the population was 1.5 million. Now it's 100 million or over 100 million. It's the same area. When you fly from Cairo to Luxor, look from the window and you see a very narrow stretch of green inhabitable area along the Nile. This is Egypt, plus the delta, which is the north. The Nile that goes from the south to the north, comes from Africa, is the equivalent of I-80 that takes you from New York to San Francisco. It is the highway of Egypt. That's where people traveled up and down. It will usually take 8 to 10 days by boat to go up and down with this highway. Always northern wind, the wind that comes from the north. So if you're sailing down, you put up your sails up and you sail down. If you're going north, you take your sails down and you go with the tide, which is 4 to 5 knots. It goes fast. So it goes both ways. The sun, this is east, this is west. So you have very simple coordinates. East-west is sun and rise and sunset. North-south is the Nile up and down. Egypt is bound by Libya, Sudan, and ancient Palestine, Syria. And these were the three enemies of Egypt. Constantly, always, Egyptians talked about the three enemies. And you find the Pharaoh holding the three enemies. Nubia, east of Egypt, and Nubians and Libyans. But their main enemy was east of Egypt, ancient Palestine, ancient Syria. There was always concern about infiltration from this part to Egypt. And you see that even in the Bible, with the story of Abraham and later on people with their famines, with their
With Joseph.
Joseph and so they were concerned about this. There were an army always stationed here, even though they subjugated the entire Canaan area, but there was always an army sitting here. They never thought of a wall, whether concrete or steel, but they should have.
Listen to our I said they should listen to our new leader.
Right.
Going online, guys.
So this is a history line, a timeline, which I'm going to use it over and over and over as a meter to tell us where we are in history. Egypt, there are signs of life in Egypt going back 25 to 30,000 years BC. But history, recorded history, starts around 3 BC, 3000 BC. Why? Because that's when writing started. So when there is writing, there is history. When there's no writing, we don't know about history. So history started 3000 BC. We are now in the present time, 2019. That's 5,000 years. I'm going to go from here to here in about an hour. It's almost the speed of light, speed of sound, but will be very quick. Will be essentially a minute. So we have the Old Kingdom. This is how the Egyptian civilization started by the Old Kingdom for about 1,000 years. Then there was an intermediate period where there were problems. Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, late period. We're going to go through that. Ptolemaic, Roman, Coptic, that came, we know, around few years after Jesus. And then you have the Islamic period till now. Talking about writing, the Egyptian language was completely dead for about 2,000 years. Completely dead. Maybe less than that, maybe 1,700 years. Nobody spoke it, because now Egyptians spoke a different language. Then, a British soldier found this piece of stone. Excuse me? That resolved the whole thing. We had it in 3 languages. One of them is hieroglyph, so that it was deciphered. Called the Rosetta Stone. Just to give you basics of the language, just to get the sense of it. That is, even though it's a dead language, but it's charged with a lot of information and knowledge. And so it has hundreds and hundreds of characters. But Egyptologists narrowed this down to basic characters like this. So this is the I, this is the C, is the K, D. These are basic characters, but there are hundreds and hundreds of characters. But we use this one as if it's the alphabet. The Egyptians did not have an alphabet, but for us, we consider this our basic alphabet.
Put your phones on silent.
Also, to give you an idea how hieroglyphs is read, it starts from where the figures are looking. So if the figures are looking this way, you go this way. If the figures are going this way, you go this way. Where the figures are looking, that where you start. Okay? I'm going to read this to you to get a sense, to give you a sense how hieroglyphs sound. Necher, Nefer, Neb, Tawi, Wizar, Matra, Sarah, Ramesses, Mary, Wizar, Di'ah. This is how it sounds. I'm going to give you an idea how it sounds. So I'm going to translate this. Necher, Nefer. Necher, Nefer, beautiful God. For those of you who know Coptic, Necher become Nuti. See the relationship between Necher and Nuti. It's close. It's really the same, but it's has changed a little bit its pronunciation. Neb Tawi, Lord of the two lands. Whenever you see two lines like this, it means the two lands, because Egypt used to be two parts, the Delta, Lower Egypt, and Upper Egypt, which is the rest of Egypt. So when the first Pharaoh came, unified the two lands. Every Pharaoh now is called the unified or the Lord of the two lands. This is the name of a king. The name of a king is always in a cartouche. Nobody can put his name or her name inside the cartouche unless he or she is a king, a pharaoh.
Excuse me, is that the oblong circle?
Yes.
That oval circle, that's where the king would put his name?
Yes.
Within that circle?
Yes, it's called a cartouche. And by the way, if you have any questions as we go along, please, let's have a conversation.
Wait, what king is that?
Huh?
Which?
This is Ramses.
Is cartouche pharaonic, like a hieroglyphic name? Cartouche, or is it?
No, that's the French name. The French, when they came, they call it cartouche. Okay, but Sarah, son of God. The king, any king is son of God. And we're going to get into that. This is the name of, every pharaoh has more than one name. So these are two of the 5 names of a pharaoh. Mary, Wizard, beloved of Osiris. Mary means beloved, loved, loving, and this Mary is always a name of a woman with another construct, and now it is Mary. So Mary, that comes from the Bible. Mary, it's really an ancient Egyptian word.
Really?
Yes. So Mary.
So the word Merry Christmas, Mary is something like that?
Merry, yes, Merry Christmas.
It's happy.
Or the name Mary in Egypt, because there are no vowels, we call it Mer.
I see.
Maybe it be pronounced as Mary, maybe pronounced as Mary, Miri, but no vowels. So it's up to us to. But the name is in the word beloved, love. Given life, Ankh is life. So if you read it this way, how would you read this? Of course, you read it this way because the figures are looking this way. So the hieroglyphs are always
When
positioned.
you say the figures, let's use the first
Yes.
one. What figure you specifically?
Look at this duck. Where is the duck looking?
Like he's pointing in that
Right. So
direction.
you go this way. So the figures are looking where you start.
He's looking towards where the
It's
beginning
pointing
is.
to where you
It's pointing
start.
to the
Right.
beginning.
Okay.
So
the
they're looking
beginning
this
would be-
way, you go this way.
Right.
Oh.
And this is going this way, you go this way.
It's pointing to where you start.
So it's the opposite of the way they're looking.
Yes.
That's correct. Right.
No, it is.
No,
Yes.
yes.
Correct.
Are they looking?
I know.
Well, because
Look, pointing at where you start.
Yeah, they're looking to the beginning. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So if you have a sanctuary here, you always put the figures looking at the sanctuary, looking at the most revered place, because the figures cannot give their back to to the sanctuary, to the door, to the holy. So this one, the door will be here. For this one, the door will be here. So always you look at if there is.
You start from the sanctuary.
If there is, yes, you start from the shikn, but they have to look at it.
Depending on your entrance.
Correct. So for this, the entrance will be here. For this, the entrance will be here. And that's what I took. I took these two from the two sides of an entrance to a sanctuary of Osiris. Clear?
Good.
Okay. So now we're all philologists, Egyptologists. We know how to write and read hieroglyphs.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely.
Also, there is a cursive way of writing hieroglyphs. So this is a hieroglyph, but there is a cursive way called. So people when they write, they're not going to start to draw the bird and the little snake and the people sitting. So they write
It's
cursive.
like script and capital.
Yes. Well, it's more than that because this is you're right. I mean, it's really cumbersome to start to really make all these drawings here. So they came out. You're going to see that when you go to the museums, you see the Book of the Dead and all of the inscriptions. So you're going to say, oh, Sameh never mentioned the cursive way. So this is the called hieratic, which means cursive, and then later on developed in another way of writing called demotic. But these are too technical between hieratic and demotic.
But they are both hieroglyphs.
They all both transliteration of this. So this is probably come from a medical papyrus about somebody complaining about his ear or his tooth. It's, the equivalent of Muhsin, Dr. Muhsin, or
Right.
as. Okay, so the academy will be writing this, and there's a lot of medical inscriptions about how to cure an ear or a tooth. A new way of writing developed by the 2nd century AD, after Christianity came to Egypt. They found that a lot easier to use a specific letters. So they used the alphabet of the Greek alphabet to transliterate. What does it mean by transliterate? If I want to write the word walad, walad is an Egyptian Arabic word for a boy. You write it in English, W-A-L-A-D. You transliterate walad into English script. And that's what they did. From the hieroglyph, they speak hieroglyph, but they write it in transliterated way in a language that came to be called Coptic. They used the Greek alphabet, but the Greek alphabet lacked 7 letters, 7 sounds. Ghin, Ain, Ha, Ghi, Ha. So they complemented that with the 7 letters, and that became the Coptic language. So the Coptic language is ancient Egyptian language written in
Greek.
Greek alphabet.
Oh.
So when the language died 1500 years before the Rosetta Stone was discovered, the only way to know how it sounded is to listen to the Coptic rituals in the Coptic churches, how they sounded. And then they knew what S was I, K, F, R, and took that and applied it to the hieroglyphs. We talk about gods, pharaohs, and people. The gods starts by creation. There are several creation stories, but they all come to the fact that in the beginning there was nothing, there was no light, there was just water, and then the god Atom pronounced a word, and the word created a void, and the void had air and vapor, and then they have 2 children, Nut and Geb, which is Nut is the upper part of the void, and Geb is the lower part of the Geb is earth and the sky. And then they have 4 children, So this is Nut, and this is Geb. So when you look at the sky, this is Nut. When you look at the earth, this is Geb. So these are parts of creation. And then they have 4 children, which I'll talk about: Osiris and Isis and Horus. So Nut, something is missing
Sameh,
here.
is this mythology or is this the way they thought? That's what
That's what they thought.
That's what they.
Yeah.
Their religion.
But
Worship.
you said
It's like
that
philosophy.
it was like 25,000 years the pharaohs have been. But according to here, it's just since they recorded it,
Right.
6,000.
Right. We know what they believed in starting 3000 BC. Before that, it's mostly based on archaeology, but no script.
Documentation.
No script. Right. But there's something missing here.
It's like what we were talking about.
Is there a test after?
Yeah, maybe. I don't have this. Okay, this is. I don't know why it's cut off, so I'll just skip this. It basically shows the Nut. The sun goes through Nut, and at night, the sun goes back at night, goes back to the mouth of Nut, but I don't know, it's cut off here, so I can't really talk about. Then we have Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Probably very important story in Egypt, that Osiris and Isis were the kings, and the king, and Osiris was a king and Isis was a queen of Egypt. Then Osiris was killed by his brother Seth and cut him into either 14 or 40 pieces. His wife Isis went looking for his parts, found correctly all his parts except one part. So put them together, that part was his penis. So,
There was no creation.
right, so she through her prayers and magical power, she put him together. He came back alive without a penis, and he became the god of the dead, or the god of rebirth, because he was reborn. However, she conceived from him, even though he had no penis, and she had Horus. So, in a way, she was a virgin that had Horus. And that image is a basic image in ancient Egyptian mythology of Isis and Horus, which is very similar to the one we know now of the Virgin Mary. And so their multitude of gods, there's so many gods. Each god has a specific realm, has specific function, has specific power, but Egyptologists debate whether all these gods were a representation of one god, which is what we know now, Tawheed.
Monolithic.
Sorry?
Monolithic. Yeah.
Monolithic,
Yes.
or it's really polytheism.
Monotheism,
Polytheism,
monotheism.
polytheism. So this is the names of just many gods here, and each area had its own god,
Wait, so your leg
but there's
has-
always the state god. The state god is the main god, whether it's sometimes Amun, Ptah. It depends on the area or the time. But other than that, each town has its own deity. Except one time, the pharaoh Akhenaten, when pharaoh came in the New Kingdom, about 1300 BC, 1400 BC, and he believed in one god, the god of Aten. And the god of Aten was represented by Akhenaten and Nefertiti. So there is, in a way, there was a trinity here, and we're gonna get to him a little later. pharaohs, it's understanding the concept of Egyptian kings. Kingship is crucial to the understanding of Egyptian culture and religion. So we talk about the pharaohs. So the pharaoh was a semi-divine or divine. It depends on which pharaoh and which Egyptologist, which historian, and which period you talk about. Sometimes the pharaoh is completely divine. Sometimes he loses this power and becomes much, much less divine. Each pharaoh has a cobra on the forehead to protect him. He has to have this long beard. And also the depiction of kingship changed from one period to the other. So in the Old Kingdom, you see that kings are completely, where they have complete divinity or as much divinity as any king in any period had, confident. And then you have the Middle Kingdom. They seem to be, they're concerned. They are melancholy. And then you go to the New Kingdom. They're all happy and youthful and beautiful. But this applies to the whole kingdom for some reason. So in a way, sculpture does tell us something about the period. Why was this king so concerned? Many, many stories came, so much ink has been spilled of why the kings of the Middle Kingdom were so sad, so concerned. These are the names of the kings. There are about 170 pharaohs that ruled Egypt and 5 queens.
I have a question. When you say ruled Egypt, what area of Egypt are we talking about?
From all the way from the Mediterranean, all the way into the Nubian border, which is the
so the whole kingdom.
the whole right, because the Nile comes near Sudan, and you have a cataract. You cannot navigate anymore. So that created the southern border of Egypt.
Over how many years?
Yes.
Over how many years did they rule the 170 king?
3,000 years.
For this reason.
Right.
Cleopatra was an Egyptian.
No, she was Greek.
Oh,
Yeah.
this is why.
This is
100%
Cleopatra.
Greek.
And this, we're not sure if she was really queen or not, but she was very strong.
But,
Nefertiti. She was.
There's speculation that that specific artifact is not real, or it was actually
This one
modeled
here?
after her husband.
This one here.
Is that true?
You
or
talk about what? Nefertiti?
Nefertiti's head.
I think there's more than one.
Well, there is.
No, but I'm saying
That's a
this
good question.
specific one. There's
Yeah.
speculation that it's not really her, and that it might have been remade like later in time, and that it was actually copied off Aten's face.
In the 1980s, there's a whole theory that started in Germany that this bust is fake.
Oh.
That the archaeologist Burchard, who supposedly found it in 1912, had it made in Germany and took it with him and buried it in the ground. And had one of his workers told him, go and excavate right there. I want you right at this point.
It's like a
So
weird
he
period in
excavated it
Germany.
there, and he found the head, and there was a whole big thing. I don't believe in this theory, and if you want to know more about it, I just wrote an article about this.
Did you?
Yes.
I just
Uh,
watched
not
it on the
about-
Smithsonian.
Yeah, not about that specifically. I wasn't going to go into that, but I will talk about it now.
Because they
I'll
said the
tell
face
you what
was specifically like it's so structurally symmetrical
Symmetrical, yeah.
that like they speculate that it can't be her real
Yes.
face.
It's funny that she mentioned that because being an ear, nose, and throat, and I used to do a lot of cosmetic surgery,
Yes,
and I used to give my lectures about what we call rhinoplasty,
Uh-huh.
nose jobs,
yes.
and I would show Nefertiti's bust, and I will tell them this is the first nose job done in the history, and this is because we think it's artificial, that there's no nose in the world that looks like.
Why do you think it's artificial?
It's perfect.
It's perfect. Well, everything is perfect, but You're right. Everything is perfect, and it's too perfect.
So
To be-
what I'm trying to say is what Jessica said maybe is true, that
Yeah.
this is not a man. This is a man-made kind of bust.
But it definitely is man-made. But they also said that a lot of Egyptian artists at the time used grids to make most of their art. They use grids. So
But
if you're
the other
if you're
one,
doing a perfect,
Egyptian
beautiful
nose is
specimen,
very
I think naturally would
Right.
be as symmetrical as possible.
But look
I
at
have a
his
close-up.
nose.
I have
Perfect. Any plastic surgeon
I have a
died
close-up.
to do this nose.
I have a close-up coming later. We'll talk
Okay.
about it later.
All right.
Okay, sorry.
But I did write an article about this,
I'll read it.
and we'll talk about when we come to it.
Okay, that's
So anyone talking about the queens, they have to have their beard, they have to have everything, the whole regalia of a king, including the beard. I just wanted to. And this is a cartouche. We talked about the cartouche. Basically, there is a raised relief and sunk relief in the carving. Outside the temples, it's usually sunk, so you get the play of shade and light. Inside, it's usually raised relief because you then have the play of sun and shade. These are the depiction of this is how Egyptians were depicted: Syrians, Libyans, and Nubians. Relief. We're all familiar with the Egyptian relief work. They play with the planes so that you have the profile, but you have the ear facing the viewer, so you get most of the features of the person. So you manipulate the planes of the face to get the. So we have some of the Nubians the same way. Egyptian statue. Egyptian statue is extremely important in Egyptology and in Egyptian culture, and we're going to find out why. So by looking at Egyptian statue, we want to know what does it say. Plato said that looking at Egyptian statue is looking at 10,000 years of history. And Sigmund Freud, I usually don't write, but I know because we have a psychiatrist here, so I'm very careful. I don't want to say the wrong word. So Freud was and Jung wrote about Egyptian art and sculpture. Freud came up with the theory of archaeological metaphor. Psychoanalysis is like archaeology in its investigation of the past. The early memory has a pervasive influence on the present. In archaeology, he was very interested in the Egyptian statue in his modern approach to psychoanalysis. Does that make sense? Maybe. Okay. So this is his
Library.
this is his library in Vienna, and this is his desk. So while he was performing his analysis, he had these statues in front of him. The Egyptian statues are statues of animals, birds, and just for the sake of tonight, we'll just concentrate on the statue of the human being. Egyptian sculpture has been always criticized by being too rigid. If you've seen one, you've seen all. Too static. There's no movement, cold. And I'm going to say this is completely wrong. It means that people, or whoever, these critics of art, miss the point. In the Chinese sculpture, there's movement. Greek, even more movement, and ultimate movement in the Indian. However, we have to think about the object of Egyptian sculpture. Egyptian sculpture is an object of religion, is object of devotion. And it's so static because the Egyptian sculpture presents the person who owns the sculpture, or the sculpture present him or her in a position waiting for the next life. All Egyptian sculpture is in a position to wait to start to move to the next life. It's completely silent, completely static. And they're looking up. They're looking to the next world. They're looking to the horizon. No movement. And if you look at the faces, they are concentration. All the faces are concentrating. And they're looking at an angle. If you try to have eye contact with Egyptian sculpture, you can't, because they are not looking at the viewer. They're looking at the hereafter. The idea of sculpture comes with the idea of death. It has to do a lot with death and the afterlife. Every human being has a soul, and they have resolved the idea is, the soul and the body. How do you differentiate between the soul, the spirit, and the body? So they said each one has a ba, or the soul, which is a bird with the face, with the head of the person. When the person dies, that ba goes out and then comes back to the tomb, or goes around to the tomb till the day of the judgment. So here is a mummy, and here is the ba coming back to visit his own mummy, and in and out, go in and out. So the mummy is very important for the resurrection, for the next life. But the ba has to be there, and the mummy has to be there. So here is the mummy, and here is the statue. So the idea that ba will come to the mummy, waiting for the next life. So what happens if the mummy is destroyed? There's a plan B. You go to the statue. So there is a strong connection, relationship between the mummy and the statue. So the Egyptian statue has a function, has a religious function. The function has to do with the next life, so that they are still, they stand, they're not moving, they're not dancing.
When the tombs were raided, did they usually leave the bodies?
Who they?
Like
the robbers?
Like the
robbers?
Yeah, the people raiding.
Well, they open because sometimes they have the jewelry, the gold inside the body.
But would they leave the body?
Some did, some.
Depends. Yeah.
So Sameh, the ba is like the spirit today, like what we believe in the spirit, sort of?
Yeah.
It's the equivalent of the spirit,
Yes,
what we believe in the
that's
spirit
right.
today.
But we resolved this because there was so much has been done by Jung and a lot of people. What is the relationship between the body, physical body, and the soul? But they said, well, it's very simple. It's a bird, and when you die, that bird goes out, but has come back to you. And if you
Did they use the imagery of a bird because of the idea of flight? Or?
Yeah.
That's why they justify the life after death.
Sorry?
That's how they justify the life after death.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So only kings and queens got mummified, or did
I would
No,
just
everybody.
say that.
higher ups?
Yeah, higher ups. Everyone gets mummified, but you get what you pay for. So if you have money, you get really good mummy.
Same there.
If not, you get just something like what we find in our excavation.
Oh, really?
So this is the day of the judgment. You have the
12.
the 12 judges, and then you have the
Is Ginsburg in there?
what?
It would have been a lot better off if she was.
There is a scale.
Ginsburg is here.
So is a lot of like modern day religion based off
A lot of
This?
things from ancient Egypt, yes.
About ancient Egyptian.
like based off ancient Egyptian ideas?
A lot.
Because like we
No.
see some similarities
There's
in other
there's
mythology.
similarity between ancient Egyptian religious beliefs and Christianity.
Yeah.
There's a lot, and there's Trinity, there's the Son of God, there's all of that.
The numbers 40, 12, 3
right.
are all significant.
3, 4, 7, 9, 12.
And why
14.
there are 12? But
Why
I
are 12?
only see 10.
12 disciples.
No, because there
That's
are
why
two
I'm
here,
asking.
two here,
Yeah, you'll find a lot.
and
There's two in the middle.
2.
He showed a few.
two here,
Yeah.
2 and 2.
Oh.
Oh.
Oh, they have to sit
But
next
there
to
are two.
someone?
My wife
You
never
make your own
believes me,
shape?
you know. So we have the
And the hat.
the balance here, and on one side we all, you know, it's known. This is the heart of the person, and here is a feather. If the heart is heavier than the feather, is not good. It's not bad news. So what happens to
It
him?
will always be.
This beast is waiting for him. It will devour him, and that's the end of him. There's no hell. You either go to heaven or you get devoured. So,
That's what they believe, but they didn't practice
Maybe,
that.
I don't know. I never
no,
know.
they didn't practice because that
Once
that
you-
really that's the day of the judgment
Yeah.
after death. But they believe that the heart has to be so light.
Is that where the saying like a heavy heart comes from?
The heavy heart comes from this day. Yes.
Lies and things.
Right.
Greed.
And then they didn't have the 10 Commandments, but they have something called the negative confession, where in the tomb they will say, I did not do this, I did not do that. And some of them will list up to 40, I did not do. And they said the 10 Commandments came from that, but made it in more of a positive one. That the negative command, it's more on the negative, I did not do, but the 10 Commandments said, you do not do that. So heaven, so this is what heaven would look like. Lots of water, lots of trees,
Plants, yeah.
plants,
Especially in
animals,
the desert.
plantings, harvesting. So this is the image of heaven, that if the heart is lighter than the feather. So the Egyptian statue was so strong in their beliefs that sometimes they wanted to kill that statue. So the best way to kill that statue is to cut his or her nose, so that you deprive him from breathing. Or talking about statues, I just wanted to show you what are these statues made of. So we have all kinds of stones, copper, gold. These are all material, limestone and sandstone. These are all material that actually were used for the except you see that these two arrows are imported. So you have wood. Egypt does not have wood, did not have wood, and did not have incense. So these are very expensive items. So when you go to the museum and you see a statue made of wood, that is imported, like driving Mercedes, the car that Sandy likes to drive, or this is this one. But wood was very expensive, and then again, you get what you pay for. If Monet wants to make a statue, he will definitely make high-end statue like this because he can afford it. But other people cannot afford, will end up with something like this. Okay.
The bird might not recognize.
Right. Again, they are almost 2,500 years, 2,200 years before the two. The same canon, the same style persisted throughout Egypt. Standing with the left foot advance, always the left foot advance. You always go with the left foot. Why the left foot? If you would know, you would be a very famous Egyptologist. We don't know why you always start with the left foot, but all thousands and thousands of Egyptian statues start with the left foot, except two statues. One in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and one in Belgium. So when you go to the museum in Cairo, look for it. And if your guy doesn't know, you show it to him.
There must
Okay?
be theories.
It's to the left as you go. Why? But we don't know why it's stuck
Is
with the
there
left.
any theories?
No.
None?
No.
Nothing
I
that
don't know.
makes it. It's worth
If you don't-
discussing.
It's strange because most people are right-handed and right.
Right.
Well,
And
like,
when you start to walk, you walk with your right foot.
Wait,
Yeah.
but left-handed
wait, wait.
people.
You wake
in
up
the
and
wedding
it's your
in the wedding march, They start with the left foot front.
The
I don't know.
one-
We do?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't remember guidance on that. Maybe that was
Also,
that must be an
Why you always start with
because
the left
Andrew
foot?
I don't know.
I
I don't
remember
know.
them
All
telling her.
Egyptian statues are like this, except the two I mentioned. Whether this was a mistake or not, but it is
What are these?
statues
That's
of
have to be
Could it be
checked.
in
not
relation?
royal,
not-
not royal.
Could it be in? I mean, like people
Yeah,
that are like.
Mankara,
My
The sign
father
of
is the one that
intelligence.
Yeah.
No,
built
the ones that are not with the left hand, the one that are with the right hand. That's what you asked, right? That's
Yeah,
what you
yeah.
asked.
I noticed their fists are always clenched also.
Yes,
they're holding something.
holding something. People sort of
Maybe
have
they're
different
holding their
ideas of what is
negative
holding.
thingies.
Is holding maybe a piece of cloth,
Somebody's holding it from
maybe
behind.
just for the structure of the
There's the hand.
statue, but they're always holding something.
Power.
And they're so this is the typical
Why
Or
does
they
it
are
work
very
for
tense.
have
Right.
someone
very
holding-
tense.
Very rigid,
What
yeah.
the statue tense or the?
No, representing what you said. Like,
It is very basic, very
Solemn.
very solemn, very
Very
static,
serious.
very serious.
yeah.
It is not for decoration. Most of these statues were done not to be viewed by the human eye. Were done to be in the tomb or in the temple, not to be viewed. It is later on that the statue took more of a political function by putting them outside the temples, so that it shows the power, the religious power of the king, like in Abu Simbel. Abu Simbel, this is outside. It's said, but they're all, you see, they're all static. There's silence there. There's somberness in them. They're very somber, and so that's another function of the statue that took.
This one has hands.
Yeah, behind, like
Someone
somebody
is
holding.
holding.
Yes,
Like a
yes,
child.
but I cut it off. Because
Yeah.
there's his wife,
Okay.
which you're going to see here. Oh, this is the builder of the second pyramid.
Ankara.
Ankara. And this is Ptolemy II. He's known because he translated the Old Testament for the first time into Greek. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, he translated into Greek.
And that wasn't until 208 BC.
What's
Right.
the oldest?
Right.
BC.
I know. I'm saying that's
Yeah.
that's later in ancient history.
I just want to show that
Yeah.
this is also very late. This is Greek, almost around the Greek end of the Greek period, and this is Old Kingdom, about 2,000 years, 2,500 years, but the same principles are the same. Standing, hands on the side, looking forward. Here also to show that the fashion changed. This is Old Kingdom, looking slim, almost aesthetic looking. The Middle Kingdom start to wear clothes that have more of fashionable dresses.
But they cut their nose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody didn't want her to come back.
Also, there are 2,000 years behind them. Very basic. Here, there are gold necklaces and their fat folds, and the life was getting good.
That was still a sign of, in this time, was still a sign of like wealth. and
Yes,
stuff, right?
and you get the folds here of
That's
They
not
didn't have
nice.
the sound beach drive.
Yeah,
that's
what
right.
good.
Very long
Um,
arms. But these statues were not where they buried them. This
Either buried with them or placed in the temple. So the person, as an act of devotion, he would commission a statue and he will put that in a temple or in a tomb. So the ones that went to the tomb, they're not viewed. They're not for even the ones that went to the temple. The temples were not really accessible to the people. So either one, this was an act of devotion.
These ones have hieroglyphics on them. Did they like tell a story or?
Their names, his job, his function
Like
in
a
life.
tombstone.
Yeah, but inside it.
Obituary.
On a tombstone.
This is just to show that always there's affection when there are statues of couples.
And they started smiling a bit.
start to smile, and then here they're holding hands. This is, and this was a tomb statue. So it's very, very romantic that even in the next life, they still want to hold hands going to the next life. And this, I like this statue very much. It's a statue of a dwarf, but the sculptor put the two children in the place of their feet, so that it looks like. And this is also a very common statue called the cube statue, or block statue, of somebody sitting waiting. He's instead of standing, he's sitting and waiting for the next life. Now we go to the Cairo Museum. Do you want to take a rest, or we're okay? Okay.
Another 10 minutes. Take a rest.
Okay.
But Sameh, there's the new museum near the pyramids now,
Right.
right? Are they both functioning, or?
I heard that the new one will open very soon for a section to the Grand Museum.
It's not open.
They eventually
You
close
guys went when they were.
No, they will still open.
keep both of them.
They will keep both of them. This will be for exhibitions, fewer and more exhibitions, and because this is inundated, it has over 100 100,000 pieces.
Yeah.
From small pieces to big.
It's too much.
100, and in the basement they have 160,000
I didn't even see
160,
it.
and some of them are in boxes and they don't know where they came from.
Stuff everywhere.
So-
The old museum was a big mess. There's stuff hanging.
But I like it. I'll tell you why I like it. So this is the Cairo Museum. Why did it go
Went the
back?
wrong
Was
way.
it going back?
I don't know.
Sam,
Maybe.
you're pressing the wrong button.
You gotta get 'em a clicker.
We already went over it.
You just put,
You're
you
going
can just
backwards.
press
Yeah.
the space bar. If you
What?
press space bar, it goes to what's next.
Okay.
In review.
Okay.
You just press
Yes.
space, and then if you want to go back, you push this one.
Okay. So good. It's Cairo Museum. Beautiful building.
Yes, it
Beautiful
is.
structure. However, it's been criticized because it's a Greco-Roman style that is not the culture of Egypt. It's Western culture, and is built to house Egyptian monuments. So you'd expect that the architectural style will be
Like a temple.
ancient Egyptian, and it wasn't. So that was complete. It was built in 1901 when Egypt was occupied by the British. So there is criticism. Why didn't
Well, at least they built us one.
they built it one? But the criticism is you could have built it with Egyptian, such
couldn't
such as the one, the Coptic Museum, as Coptic architectural style, or the Islamic Museum that has Islamic style. I'm just telling you a criticism, and it could have been like this one. This is the tomb of Sa'd-Zarur. It's all ancient Egyptian
Is
style.
the new one Egyptian
Yeah.
ancient Egyptian
Yeah.
architecture?
Yeah, yes.
The new one looks like a warehouse. It's really
Yeah,
very-
it has been criticized by a lot,
very
done by
bland.
Irish, and they have a lot of problems from what I understand by Irish architect, but you know I have not seen it really. So this is the museum from inside, and I like it from inside. To me, there are so many objects there, some of them on top of each other, and to me, I think this is how the ancient Egyptian temple looked like, because people used to bring their statues, put their statues till the temple is completely filled with statues. You take the statues, bury them in the ground. So to me, inside, this is how the ancient Egyptian temple looked like.
More authentic.
Maybe. I'm going to go through few objects from the museum that I just want to talk about, because you can spend days in the museum. One of them is Nefertiti. This is another statue of Nefertiti in the museum, which I really like very much. It's made of quartzite, which is very hard Stone, extremely hard. And when one looks at the statue, have to always think about the material. Is the material gypsum or granite or quartzite? This is very hard. So I think it's, compare this with that. When you go, take a look at it. It's a beautiful statue, really beautiful, made of quartzite. This statue, going back to this statue, made of limestone covered with gypsum. So when you cover with gypsum, this is very easy, fluid, malleable material. You can shape it. But this is quartzite. If you make a mistake with the vermilion line of the lips or the nose, the whole thing is gone. This is so intricate. So take a look and let me know what you think when you go there. Now we go to the nose of Nefertiti. It's a nose job, maybe, but this all, it's so easy. It's so easily done because this was done by hand over the gypsum over the limestone. And yes, many people said it's a fake, and they said it's completely symmetrical. But I went to the museum. I spent some time in the museum in Berlin, and when you look very, very closely, it's not really symmetrical. There are variations, but when you're there, you find the cheeks are different. The lines here are different than lines. You wouldn't tell here. But what the article I wrote that should appear soon is about this eye.
You wrote a whole article about an eye.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a very important
Yes.
eye.
It's about 15 pages about this eye.
Wow.
So you look at this here. The iris is always round, correct?
Yeah.
Is this round?
No.
One side is straight,
Right,
the one inside, yeah.
right. So there's a missing part here. You see this?
She had surgery.
You see here, it should have been here, this one,
Cataract.
right?
No.
You see this line here?
Yeah.
So that if you have this line, you have a
Means they could have done
complete
it.
circle. I found a photo of this statue in 1922 when it was first exhibited in Berlin with this iris completely round.
Oh.
So what happened?
They tried to take it
Read
off,
my article.
like this one.
Read my article.
All right, let us know when it's out.
Okay, what happened in sometime after 1925, the museum curator, his name was Schaefer, he gave permission to the chemist to open the eye, open it out, because they wanted to know how it's made, because it's so unusual and it looks so real. And they found that this iris, black iris, is made of beeswax mixed with soot to make it black. And in putting it back, they lost this piece.
It survived all that.
Okay.
It doesn't
And
survive.
they,
German
put,
guy
and,
goes
they,
and dissects
and they
it.
put it into a small bag and called From the Eye of Nefertiti. Go forward till 1980s, when there was what you were talking about. There was a movement that this bust is fake. So the museum wanted to know if it's really fake or not. So took whatever was left of this beeswax, sent it to the Getty Museum, because to date it, to see the date and the age of the beeswax, and found it's 3,000 years. So we know it is ancient. But we know also that the museum had damaged part of this iris. And my article is telling the museum they should disclose all the information they have about what happened to this eye.
And how about the other
What,
one?
yeah.
No, the other eye was never found, even when it was excavated, it was not there.
Oh, like the German didn't damage the other
No,
eye.
no,
No, they
no.
didn't.
Because we
Find
heard
it.
that the
They looked for it though.
They looked for it, yes. You're very good.
I watch
She
the,
just
no,
watches.
Oh,
no,
you
no,
watch it,
I
you
watch the Smithsonian Channel every
Okay.
night.
It's ready for
I'm a nerd. It's fine.
Another statue I like in the museum. It's a goddess Sekhet. This is the daughter of Ramses. I'm just telling you a few of the objects that I like in the museum.
Yeah, right.
Broken off.
Is it like,
Tutankhamun.
He has a perfect nose too.
do they take the noses off when they don't like the person?
Yeah, they
Yeah.
destroy.
Yeah,
Oh,
they
it's
throw
so
it. So
rude.
they kill him.
They don't breathe.
Sometimes they do the eyes also.
It's not nice.
Tutankhamun, the famous Tutankhamun.
Handsome
She
man.
stopped. She speaks English.
That is his statue in Luxor, and this is his tomb when it was first discovered. And this was they ran a
CT scan.
CT scan on his body, and then when we opened it, everything was complete except his penis. Again,
That's who's this?
Tutankhamun.
Why is
He's
his
the
head
father
so,
of Aten.
His
right?
head, his skull is weird.
Isn't he the father of Aten?
No, he was
No, he
young.
was young.
He was the
Yeah.
son.
He
I
died
don't know
young.
who's. Maybe he's the son of
didn't,
Knappus.
didn't the Aten, the one that moved the capital, didn't he
Akhenaten.
also have
Akhenaten.
yeah?
Akhenaten.
Didn't he also have a birth defect that made
Yeah.
his head look like that?
His daughters did.
Oh,
His
okay.
daughters did.
Sameh has a whole lecture about Tutank, by the way.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating.
And this is a
How did he die?
this is a show that made in Times Square about 3 years ago, and I just want to. I didn't get a picture of the lines that were going around the block, and you have to pay $27 to get in there. So, but it was an odd place to have that in Times Square.
Yeah.
And this is the Queen Merendes, who supposedly is of the. You know what this?
Music?
The opera?
Yeah.
Aida. So the opera Aida is based, this is the Queen Merendes in the opera. And this is another piece, another piece in the Cairo Museum is the stela called the Israel stela or the Victor stela. And many people come and look at this little piece here because it said Israel, and the whole stela is talking about Libyan battle and the victory over the Libyans. And then at the bottom he said, but I also defeated 8 cities in Palestine, one of which is Israel. And that was by King Merneptah, whom I've written my dissertation about him. And he's accused of being the king of the Exodus, but he's not. And Ramses is not. There's no way that they are. So,
Who is the
Do
king?
you know which one?
do I know which one? Well, first we have to agree there was an Exodus.
Here we go.
No, I'm saying because, well, it's a long discussion. But if there is an Exodus, I think the Exodus took place around the year 1550 or 1500, 1550. Who said 1500? Very good, yes. Around there, around the time of Hexus. Because during the reign of this king, or Ramses, Egypt controlled the entire part of Palestine, Syria. So that the Exodus could not have taken place after they crossed the Red Sea. Still, it's Egyptian land all the way to the Euphrates. They're all under Egyptian army. It could not have happened during this time. So it would have happened before Egypt controlled this part of Palestine, or after. Before it will be Hexus, after it will be the Dynasty 23, which is much later. So most likely it's during the Hexus.
Ramses was which dynasty?
The Dynasty 19, which
Was,
we're going to come to a battle where he had it near the Euphrates.
And if it's the dynasty 19, would be like within the 3,000 years.
Within?
She means like old kingdom, new kingdom, which
It was
kingdom?
closer to the Christ than the time where Moses was. Moses was 5,000 years before Christ. And Ramses would be
No.
3,000?
First, we have no, I'm talking from Egyptian evidence, from the Egyptian background, from the Egyptian information we have. We don't know anything about the biblical narrative. We don't know anything about Moses, Joseph, or any.
How
No,
many years before?
we don't know. The Bible mentioned the Pharaoh. The Bible mentioned Ramses, that the Hebrews were working in the palace of Ramses. Ramses, Ramses. So Ramses could be a name that used in hindsight. You know, later on they mentioned Ramses. But Ramses was 1200 or 1300 before Christ.
That's all.
Right.
So somebody writes somewhere.
Well, that's a book I have about this period,
Oh.
and this is
That's
this is the thing
That's
you
his
see.
mommy?
That's his mummy of Ramses.
Yeah, that's
No,
right.
Ramses or
Yeah, that's
No,
right. I had a
Meneptah,
postcard.
the one before.
Ah.
So anyway, this one here, this supposedly the king that died, that drowned in the Red Sea after the Exodus, but they had examination and they found that there were no signs of death by drowning.
He was shot.
Somebody
Was shot
stabbed
in the
him
head?
in the back.
No,
with his
in the back because his head
skull.
stuck, and when they did the mummification, they put resin, and while they were putting him out, this piece is just came out.
So he's dead already.
Yeah. So this is Ramses, and that you'll see in the museum.
It's 90 years.
Do bodies like that smell?
No. They're too dry.
They're so old and
They're
dry.
too dry, yeah.
Like petrified.
So we have this little,
They're dead. They're not
all this little ostraka that show little things here and there. And what do we see here? We see a mouse sitting
eating a fish.
on a high chair, would have a drink, and then there's a cat offering him a duck or a chicken and fanning him. So the mouse became the master and the cat became
The servant.
the servant. So what is the relevance? This is times, you can see that at some point, sometimes in the history, there was some dissatisfaction with some humor, but also something about the rulers.
Like they wanted
At
to
sometimes
see
we know there were strikes, there were robberies, but these at times were dissatisfaction with the system.
This was like a New York Times cartoon.
Right.
This
Political
Tahrir
cartoon.
Square.
This is Tahrir Square. Now we jump 2,000 years, 3,000 years later in Tahrir Square during the 2011 revolution. And
Never saw
you
that.
look at the walls, they had this here. In the walls they had the graffiti, the cat, the mouse sitting here, the mouse here and the cat serving him. It didn't
Still relevant.
That was
Yeah.
very smart. Who?
hit it.
Wow.
You said several times, I saw it in Cairo and in Luxor.
That's very smart
That's
of them.
very an Egyptologist.
And here is it. That's what they did.
Oh wow.
This
So they
is
destroyed all this now.
Mubarak serving the people of Egypt. And Mubarak is offering a duck to the people of Egypt and became the servant. Now we go to the pyramids. You gonna take some time off? Or you, huh? Yes? Yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
take a break.
Great. Definitely look at it.
Close to start, please.
It's really very informative.
Hmm?
Very nice.
Now
My
we're
friend
learning
is
we
the
have,
director of
right?
the museum.
lot of information.
Which museum?
Yes,
Yes,
museum.
yes, sure.
That's
Yeah,
That's it. Yeah, my best friend.
سلمي لي عليه.
وكانوا يدرسني زي
Oh, you are a Egyptologist.
Oh, yeah.
Ah, you are. لا أنت you are
لا أنا مهندسة.
مهندسة إيه؟ Civil engineering.
Yes, it's my
So that's why I'm wondering about.